To our last bill of the evening, House Bill 6230, sponsored by excuse me, Representative Ranglin-Vassell. It is an act related to labor and labor relations, specifically wages. It defines and recognizes the existence of the potential liability of led entities concerning the payment of wages. I do not see the representative here, but we have several witnesses. Tim Scanlon, Construction Industries of Rhode Island. Is he here? Lilia Barra, GBLSMA. Gregory Persons, IWCC. Come forward, Gregory.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, for the opportunity to speak to you about this bill tonight.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you. So my name is Greg Pearson. I'm currently a Massachusetts resident, but I lived in Rhode Island for 20 years previously. And I'm currently the director of the IWCC, which is the Immigrant Worker Center Collaborative. We're a regional network of 9 worker centers between Massachusetts and Rhode Island, including Fuerza Laboral here in Rhode Island, that work together to end the exploitation of workers. And I'm here representing Massachusetts because we had similar legislation entitled An Act to Prevent Wage Theft and Promote Employer Accountability, which was introduced in Massachusetts last session. It quickly garnered over 100 co-sponsors and passed through the Senate. Unfortunately, the session ended before it was able to make it through the House, but it's been introduced again this year, currently with 136 co-sponsors and a lot of momentum. So I'm here to talk a little bit about what this bill is all about and why we think it's so important. We've all heard about employers outsourcing or offshoring jobs to cut labor costs or avoid labor law. Subcontracting, while it's a useful tool in some specific instances, is largely being abused by unscrupulous employers as a kind of domestic outsourcing of responsibility. In this way, these unscrupulous employers can have the best of both worlds. They can have cheap labor, and they can also say, we had no idea when it comes up that there were labor abuses, such as workers' comp fraud, wage theft, or lack of health and safety. We found that these days, through our work with the immigrant worker centers throughout the region, that subcontracting is one of the principal vehicles for wage theft. I brought some research that we did in Massachusetts, and we know it's happening here too, and I'll leave that with you tonight. But just to briefly touch on that, we found that in Massachusetts, annually, $700 million are being stolen from low-wage workers. Only 5,200,000 of those are recovered each year by the Attorney General. And I know the situation is similar here in Rhode Island, where the Department of Labor and Training Investigative Division of Wage and Hour is so drastically understaffed that they have 600 or more cases per year that they're not able to get through. So in Massachusetts, we found that this equaled $280 million of lost GDP for the state per year, 2,430 lost jobs, and 13,500,000 in lost taxes. And I'll leave the explanation of that information for you in the packet. We believe that wage theft hurts everyone. It depresses wage and conditions for everyone and sets the floor of expected bids so low that there's no way that legitimate businesses can compete. I also will leave you some research from the National Employment Law Project, which found that, for example, labor violations are endemic to the janitorial industry. It's literally built on the expectation that workers will not be paid. One cleaning company contractor, and I have this in the information I'll leave for you, reported that a big box store offered them $425 to clean the entire store 7 days a week, which is far below minimum wage. And this was the expected bid that they wanted the contractor to do the work at. Companies may say that it's too much of a burden to determine if their subs are following the law, but we believe there's one simple question they can ask. Is the bid too good to be true? We know that if you buy a new car for $1,000, you know that you're buying stolen property, and you're held accountable as an accomplice to that. In a similar vein, if you have a subcontractor who's bidding at 30 to 40% below what reputable companies are offering, you've got to ask how they're doing it. If you want to look the other way to save money, we believe that you should be held accountable for receiving hot goods. Good businesses want this kind of accountability and want this kind of legislation. They're tired of being undercut by companies making shady deals with law-breaking subs. Thank you so much, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the interest of learning from some of the other people who testified before here, we support this bill. Thank you.
Any questions? Maybe you changed your mind. Thanks. Elizabeth Seaver? Ready to talk to you?
Only one quick testimony per hearing, unfortunately. It's the limit. Elizabeth Seaver on behalf of the Greater Providence Chamber of Commerce in opposition to this legislation. The basis of our opposition to this legislation, as this committee has heard me say before, I'm not in the habit of making apologies for employers that don't follow the established labor laws. My concern with this bill, however, is that it would create liability for an entity that not only has no way to control another entity's behavior, but also has no way to sometimes know that these things are going on. So for that reason, we oppose this legislation. I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you to the committee for hearing my testimony this afternoon. I'm with the Metro West Worker Center out of Framingham, Massachusetts, and a lot of workers from Rhode Island have come to us being owed wages on both in after-hours cleaning at supermarkets particularly, but also in construction. And I'm going to direct myself particularly to construction and the upper end of residential construction, just by way of a sort, because I think that defines the conditions, at least in that industry, as opposed to talking to some of the smaller players. And I'm going to choose three examples that I think go to show that employers know very often that they are hiring folks with a checkered history in terms of subcontracting, but because there is no consequence, it doesn't affect their bottom line. They're not liable. They can continue to contract them. I'll use a couple of examples, and I'll then can take questions. I've got many more that I can offer. We just one of the bigger New England contractors is Callahan Inc. Out of forgotten the name of the town, not too far away. We had negotiated with them along with folks out of Rhode Island for the payment of some workers who did luxury condominium construction, siding specifically in downtown Wellesley, right in the middle of town. We went into that conversation with them. They were apologetic about what had happened, said that some of the money was in escrow, and that their experience with this contractor was such that they would never hire them again. That money turned out not to be in escrow, and we've discovered that they are on a current Callahan job in Somerville today. And they just stopped communicating with us once it became clear that the subcontractor had not put that money in escrow. I'll mention a company which I think is at least trying to turn over a new leaf, Force Corporation. We collected wages for them 3 times last year for Rhode Island workers, actually, up in various parts of Massachusetts. These are, and we're talking, Toll Brothers, Pulte Homes, the big players in the industry. The workers would go on their own to the superintendent's trailer, explain that they weren't being paid, be told, sorry, we paid, we did our end of the, we complied with our end of the bargain. You just have to go after the sub. The problem with so much of residential construction at the moment is that there are often at least 4 layers of subcontracting between the worker and the general contractor, and that and several of those layers are typically out of state. So that in practical terms, it would take years, and the ability of a state court to enforce any kind of judgment is really minimal. A Force Corp last year entered into a $2.4 million consent agreement with the Department of Labor to pay unpaid overtime. And yet companies continue to hire them and continue to look the other way as they, as these conditions emerge. The last wages we collected against them were in January of this year. 9 months after that consent agreement was, a public record. I'll leave it at that unless there are questions. I could mention Avalon Bay and the workers again out of Rhode Island who 3 different crews didn't get paid, and each time the superintendent would just tell them, it's not our problem, and it isn't their problem. And I think the point of legislation like this is that by making the general contractors ultimately responsible, the problem goes away, because they're not going to hire folks who are going to who are going to make them pay twice. So that's at least our experience. These are really vulnerable workers. They deserve some measure of protection, and I think it's a problem that we can eliminate simply by bringing accountability to the system.
Any questions for the witness? Thank you.
Thank you, sirs.
Lynette Boiselle, NRICC and ABCRI.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I am here on behalf of the Northern Rhode Island Chamber of Commerce and the Associated Builders and Contractors of Rhode Island. As Elizabeth alluded to earlier, we have a concern from a liability point of view for this bill. I don't want to keep repeating, but as Elizabeth also said, one of the things we can't do as a lead contractor is we have no legal authority to look at another company's payroll. We have no ability to look at another company's employee files. So there's just really no way for a lead entity to be able to control that situation. This bill also goes far beyond that, though. This bill seems to allow an entity that is an indirect entity to also be pulled into civil liability. What do I mean by that? Let's say I have Boiselle subcontracting, and I can't do the job that a lead entity wants, so I suggest Casey subcontracting might be able to do it. He gets the job, he ends up having some wage violations or some other type of violation. Because I referred him, I am indirectly involved. So I could also end up with some liability in this situation. The other thing that I would point out is the bill references not just wage issues, but all of Title 28. So Title 28 includes things like banning fees for employment applications, asking for tax info during an application process for employment, banning employers for video and audio taping employees in private places. There are so many things in Title 28, the liability just balloons. So I'd be happy to answer any questions, but we do oppose the bill.
Any questions for the witness? Yes, Representative Regenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In talking about they don't have control over this, the previous witnesses were talking about how ultimately it has to come down to doing some research, knowing what the numbers are, and being able to spot this looks like this could potentially be fishy. How else can you solve it without saying there is a responsibility to be thinking about these things at the initial point?
I'm not exactly sure how to answer your question, but because if I hire your company, if I were going to try to comply with this, I would have to be in your office every week, looking through your employee files, checking your weight, your checks that you hand out, checking your withholding of employees. I would have to be literally in your office just about every week. And that's just impossible.
Would you say if my company has a history with this kind of stuff, or I come to you with numbers that seem, wow, these numbers couldn't possibly work if they're actually abiding by the laws, would you say that you would have any responsibility to take a look at what I was coming to you with?
I think the person I'm hiring has a responsibility to pay their employees the amount agreed upon. And if they don't, then that employer should be held responsible.
Any further questions? Thanks, Lynette. Okay, next witness is Raul Figueroa. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Rhode Figueroa. I'm a community organizer at Fuerza Laboral. My job as a community organizer for that organization is to recover lost wages. And I'm going to start this with telling you a story that happened in June of 2016. We were representing a group of 8 people who performed work doing residential cleaning for this cleaning company. They worked for 43 and a half hours that week, 8 people. It amounted to a total of $2,300 for that week of work. At the end, the employer told them that he wasn't happy with the work and he wasn't going to pay them. Then he used one of those workers, and he personally classified that person as a subcontractor. And the way he tried to play it out is that person contacted the other people to work for him. But in reality, he trained them. He's the one who gave them the equipment. He's the one who told them exactly what needed to do. He was responsible for it. But he sat in front of them. We had a meeting in our office with the employer and the 8 people, and he looked at them in the face and told them that he was not going to pay them because he was not responsible, because the other person that he called, he said that he was the subcontractor, was actually responsible for it. Which in reality, he used that tool in his advantage. And I've got to say, there's definitely pros and cons when it comes to subcontracting, because a lot of people who are actually trying to get into the subcontracting business do have a dream, and they do want to get their business started, and they want to compete with the big guys. But the reality is that in a lot of the things that we see, and that the general contractor use them to not be liable when it comes to any labor violations, such as wage theft and worker compensation, and any accident at work. So this is just one of the examples that we see every day. We have a lot of them, and this is one of the tools that a lot of the people who doesn't want to be responsible for it use it to basically get out of trouble. So I just wanted to leave it at that. I'm happy to take any questions if you have any.
Any questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Benjamin Bouchard. Welcome,
Thank you,
Benjamin.
Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Ben Branchard. I'm with the Carpenters Union Local 94 here in Rhode Island. I submitted written testimony, but I just kind of wanted to paint a little bit better of a picture. So I guess imagine you're the Attorney General or Matt Weldon, and a construction worker comes to you and says, I haven't been paid.
I've imagined being Attorney General a few times.
Yeah, you can close your eyes if you want. So it's a whole experience. So a construction worker comes up to you, Attorney General Craven, and says, I haven't been paid.
Say that one more time. I want to hear it.
Attorney General Craven. A construction worker comes up to you and says, I haven't been paid in 3 months. And you, who do you go to file that complaint? You would go to their immediate employer. Sometimes that's literally just some guy. Like, it's just this guy that we call labor brokers or labor sharks, who are kind of like the Pied Pipers of worker exploitation. They kind of bring crews around to different construction sites and put them to work. And they're subcontractors, but not really. They're not registered anywhere. They're providing work to subcontractors. So it creates this really long chain. And in working with the Department of Labor and the Attorney General on cases of wage theft, it's very difficult to work your way down or up that chain. The blame either goes up or down, and nothing gets done. So it continues, because if you get away with something for so long, it continues. And to say that these general contractors have no way of knowing is incredible. I mean, there's trailers on every job site. There's one trailer that that the general contractor and subcontractor shares. They take bids from these subcontractors, like somebody said, 40% less than a legitimate contractor. Like these people are bidding the cost of materials and then a little bit more. And it's for the general contractor to say we had no idea that this was a fishy bid is crazy. And they're sharing these trailers, and people on the job sites are talking to each other and saying that they're being exploited. And people from unions and other agencies are also telling these general contractors and developers that these companies that they continuously use are engaged in these practices, and they continue to hire them. And the indirect employer thing, I don't think that means, well, I referred them to you, so now I'm an indirect employer, so now I'm responsible civilly. An indirect employer would be one of these labor brokers that I'm talking about, where it's not the direct employer, it's a separate employer. So I don't want it to be spoken into truth that an indirect employer equals somebody who refers somebody else. Like, hey, I know a great plumber, now I'm responsible for wage theft. I don't believe that to be the case at all. So I guess that's it. I'm in support of this bill because it holds contractors responsible and accountable. And not only, like somebody else before me also said, this bill, just by looking at it, kind of eliminates the issue. It's not, even if a fraction of this bill were to pass, it would be like a saving grace to the construction industry. For the general contractor to know that they could be responsible, they'll look closer at those bids, and they'll look closer at what's happening on their job sites. They're the superintendents. The developers have project managers that are on a job site that know what's going on. The general contractors have superintendents that know what's going on. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Representative Cunha.
As a general contractor, I don't mind the bill, but I will say this, though. When I'm looking at different proposals and bills, there are companies who have maybe 30% of their estimate because they have the management fees. And there's the management part of it, there's foreman, there's a big part of the actual general conditions before they even get to the work. So, and then we have another company who has two managers who are busy on the same project who can certainly take away a big portion of that and start getting into the actual work scope. So that's where I see a little bit of a discrepancy, because not all companies, and I can tell which bids come in through, and I know that some companies are really paying really low labor, but it also, there's, in my defense, and I think for a lot of the general contractors, when estimates come in, and you see a company that's probably 15 to 20% less, and you kind of know the company, and you know that they're known for having like 15 managers on a project, which is totally not even worth it. It's not really necessary when you have a smaller company who has maybe two managers on a company who can be a little bit more competitive in their bid. So I can see both sides of the.
So if it's managerial fees that are driving up the costs, then the general contractor would have nothing to worry about, because it's not worker exploitation that's lowering the cost. It's a lack of managers. So it's kind of a.
Sure, but they're not going to scope that out they're not going to line item that for you. You know, they're going to give you a estimate of, it's costing you $50,000, and this guy's saying it's going to cost you $30,000. So they'll hide that within their programs and their fees. So, but yes, I can understand what you're saying. That was it.
Any more questions of the witness? Thank you.
Thank you.
Randall Rose, I don't see him here. He signed up to testify in favor. Mike Arroyo, Rhode Island Jobs with Justice, no testimony, but he's in favor. John Simmons from RIPEC, against. He's provided written testimony. Rhode Island Business Coalition, against. Written testimony only. Henry or Heine Maldonado, in favor, provided written testimony, which brings us to Justin Kelly from the Painters Union.
He has written testimony here.
Oh, written testimony?
That's what we
okay.
just received, yes.
And Greg Mancini from Build Rhode Island, who I do not see here. And there are no other witnesses. That concludes testimony on House Bill 6230, and it concludes our evening's festivities. Do I have a motion to adjourn? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The ayes have it.